Hello, you are so very, very welcome to this evening's PODINAR. My name is Avril Flynn and I'm coming live to you from Dublin. And I have a wonderful panel of experts to discuss toddler nutrition, what matters. The aim of this PODINAR is to discuss what we all see as the current issues that affect toddlers when it comes to diet and feeding, and to raise awareness with us as healthcare professionals as how we can best help parents and patients alike going through this phase, which, as I know with personal experience, can be very challenging. I'm the parent of a toddler myself. As this PODINAR is not the same as a webinar, we really hope that you, as the audience and fellow healthcare professionals, will help shape the discussion and the topics that come up by asking questions throughout, which I will then feed through to our panel of wonderful experts. This really is a golden opportunity to tap into the vast experience of the experts that we have here, so please don't miss it and please do engage as much as you can. We have some topics in mind, but as I said, this will be led by you guys. And without further ado, our wonderful panel includes Lucy Upton, who is a children's dietitian, Dr. Jill Harris, who is based in the Birmingham Food Refusal Service, and Dr. Ellie Cannon. But I'll allow them to introduce themselves. So firstly, Dr. Jill Harris.
Hello. I have spent my entire life, I think, dealing with children's food refusal and food acceptance, both in a research capacity, and now I work with children specifically who have ARFID, avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, in a clinical capacity.
And Lucy Upton, next. Could you introduce yourself?
Of course. Hi, Avril. Thank you for having me. So my name is Lucy. I'm a paediatric dietitian. I've worked in lots of different settings with children, from community to tertiary centres like the Children's Hospital. I'm now the director of my own business, and I do a lot of extra work in feeding clinics and in early years nutrition.
And finally, Dr. Ellie Cannon.
Hi there, I'm Ellie. I'm an NHS GP and mum of two. I do a lot of writing and broadcasting, and the first book that I wrote, Keep Calm, the New Mum's Manual, is all about parents and children under the age of 1, with lots written about weaning and solid foods. So yeah, thank you for having me.
It is so great to have you all here, and I can't wait for a lively and interesting discussion for all the healthcare professionals that are hopefully watching, or certainly watching this back. So to kind of start us off, Dr. Jill, I'll come to you first. What do you think are the most kind of current issues in toddler diet and feeding? And in particular, what would you like to highlight in our chat? And I'll ask that question to the rest of the panel when you're done.
I feel, certainly in my experience, it is, the fussiness that you get in toddler years. What do you do about it? What's the correct approach? How seriously do you take it? When does it become something that you need to be concerned about? And I think parents are just, we were having this discussion earlier, just affected so much by guidance. I think Lucy has said, what you should be feeding, what the child should be eating. And parents are trying to get a massive range of foods into toddlers. That's just not something that they're going to be able to do. They're frantic about putting broccoli in or carrots in. So yeah, it's parental concerns, I think, about children's fussiness and food refusal.
And Lucy, same question. What do you think are the kind of real driving concerns at the moment that you find in your clinics with, parents and amongst ourselves as healthcare professionals?
Sure. I mean, I think I would mirror what Jill would say, certainly, and particularly through and post the pandemic, there has been perhaps increasing anxiety with perhaps parents reaching out on social media platforms and trying to empower themselves with education, but having to sift through everything that's out there to sort of make decisions about feeding their toddler and what they should be feeding. I think, put my real nutrition hat on, it's interesting to see that there are also parents and professionals bringing up discussions that have perhaps been pertinent in an adult arena for a while and are now starting to filter down to children. So things like gut health, plant-based nutrition, supplementation, and as I say, that probably feeds into this sort of bigger picture of parents being very worried about a lot of things with their toddler, and those things that they might want to focus on not always matching up with what's going on for a child in terms of their development. So like Jill says, wanting them to perhaps eat, 25 different types of vegetables, which is just not going to happen. So I think that parents get this tug, and as professionals, it's interesting having those discussions to make, advice and guidance very relatable for children of this age.
And Ellie, would you kind of echo those feelings in your practice, kind of on that kind of frontline point of contact that parents and fellow healthcare professionals might kind of link in with you and say, what are the current issues that are really driving what people are talking about?
Yes, I would. I suppose the difference between myself and Gillian and Lucy is that GPs, as you say, are often the first point of contact. And to give sort of like an optimistic message, a lot of the parents with toddlers that I see, they're actually normal. Their nutrition is normal. So they're coming, they're questioning, as Gillian said, they don't eat broccoli, or maybe they don't do this. And we're able to say, actually, you're fine. The child's weight is fine. They're healthy, they're growing. And actually, so we see a lot of normal. So that's good. I think there's such a huge range now, even if I look back to when I had toddlers over a decade ago, there's a huge range of advice, and that's very confusing and conflicting. There's a huge range of products and a huge range of food, and there's a huge range also of pathologies that we recognise now, whether that is cow's milk protein allergy or sort of other things. So I think it's just sort of an area that's really exploded. So you can understand that people are really, really desperate for good, solid advice in terms of toddler nutrition.
And Lucy, coming back to you, you touched very briefly then how, I would certainly, feel this myself. The pandemic has really changed not only the lexicon of what we're discussing, but the picture of some of the big problems as healthcare professionals, as getting nutrition right and the balance of the information that we're getting, because there is just so much information. It's hard enough for us as healthcare professionals to cut the wheat from the chaff, literally. It can be even more difficult for our parents and clients.
Yeah, and I would say that certainly parents in clinic with me do reflect that. And like Ellie said, a lot of the time it's great to be able to rationalise things for them and listen and hear parents' concerns and the information that they are bringing with them to clinic or that appointment. Sit down and, it's so important to hear them, even if we might have our own agenda as health professionals, that, those parents have gone out, they've sought that information, they want the answers, and they want those answers, to relate to their child. So I certainly think it's sort of a double-edged sword. I would say there's a lot of parents coming to me who have a lot of good information. And then there's probably the other end of the spectrum where parents are feeling, and mental health is probably on top of this been a significant concern during the pandemic for parents anyway, with a lack of support. Parents feeling exceptionally anxious about many aspects of their child's health, whether that be their feeding, the fact that they haven't had growth checks, what is normal, and understanding, there's that big spectrum of normal that we know as health professionals, but parents may not have had that exposure to as well, particularly if they've, had a baby in a pandemic who's a toddler now and they haven't had lots of time to mix and be around other children the same age. So, yeah, I would say it's certainly been a challenge for parents to navigate that and continue to navigate that information.
Dr. Jill, in your practice, you've done, enormous 3 decades of research into food refusal. And have you found in the last 2 to 3 years that in your clinic and in your research that, it's never really it isn't just a child, but it's the entire family and that you kind of need to bring on board? Or what's your experience of that with regards food refusal and how bad it can be or when it's a problem?
Right, a lot of questions there.
Sorry, lots of questions there.
Certainly it's got worse during the pandemic. because the children I work with who do have a problem, they have an eating disorder, they eat so few foods that we class it as an eating disorder. And of course, where you have high anxiety, and the pandemic has certainly induced that in families completely, then the child's eating will become worse. Yeah, they will drop food, they will lose weight. So you get the whole family then becoming extremely anxious and isolated in the pandemic, not able to access mental health support. So they were sort of on their own, basically. And you think, well, if you've got a toddler as well, they're going through the neophobic stage, and Lucy was talking about the stage of development. So as you come to 2, most children will start to reduce anyway. So parents start to panic because the child is reducing and they don't know why. And it's just a normal developmental stage. And then they don't know where to go and get their advice because they're not going to nurseries, they're not talking to other mums outside, nobody's normalising this, they're not visiting grandparents. And of course, then we will have those children, you say, when does it become a problem? So some children with extreme sensory problems will develop an eating disorder, ARFID, avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. And gradually through the neophobic period, their range of foods that they accept will decrease until they're on the basic dry carbohydrates. So they probably have only under 20 foods. And of course, then parents really are anxious. And again, they haven't been able during the pandemic to really access support for that eating disorder and how to manage it. And I'm afraid sometimes health professionals haven't or don't always give the best advice. So they will give advice that you might give to a normal, mildly fussy child, and that doesn't work for a child with extreme food refusal.
And Ellie, in your kind of experience, it can be very hard, and I think you've the perfect storm, haven't you, within the pandemic, where people haven't been able to access services. We've all been stretched to our max in every which way of our practice, so things can fall down the rung of importance. And I suppose, are you seeing children that, with a bit of earlier intervention, there could have been, with toddlers, it could have been easier to solve? Or do you think that we still have a long way to go as healthcare professionals giving the right information?
Well, certainly both of those. I mean, exactly what Gillian says is right. People throughout the pandemic lost their social scaffolding, and whether that's scaffolding that we realise we've lost, like not seeing our children's grandparents, for example, or just not chatting at the nursery school gates with another mum, or this sort of thing. And that sort of led people, that pushed everybody online. It made people very insular, exactly sort of as Gillian described. So people sort of can feel very alone and isolated with these issues. And then I think the other thing to say, and I say this as a GP, and I say this as somebody with lived experience of restrictive eating disorders within family, GPs, doctors do not know a lot about nutrition. Now, we've probably got some GPs watching who perhaps do have more of an interest in nutrition, diet, nutrition, but generally speaking, it's not something that we're particularly taught. It's not something that we have great access to services with. And so I'm not sure. I think GPs and perhaps health visitors also, although health visitors I think are broader in their outlook, and we tend to focus on the medical side of things. What's the child's weight? Are they reaching their developmental milestones? And then we sort of hit a brick wall. Okay, there's clearly a restrictive problem here, or there's clearly something like ARFID or whatever it might be. But we're not particularly well versed in that. I will hold my hands up and say that. I don't think generally GPs are. And often we don't have the services behind us. And so it's really a case of pushing to find those services, which can be found, whether that's through CAMS or through the dietitian services, or looking online, looking at third sector services, looking at private routes, depending what patients can afford.
And Lucy, we've had a question in, what reliable sources of advice are there that we as healthcare professionals can actually direct parents to?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the first thing I would say is, and this might seem really obvious, is make sure that wherever you're directing them, it's evidence-based. So that there is something, there is a good evidence base behind it. It is age-appropriate advice, and a little bit like sort of Jill has alluded to, there will also be differing advice based on, where a child is within a spectrum of fussy or moving into problem eating, feeding disorders. But certainly, I would, controversially, I would reflect that perhaps some of the first line places that you might go to online or you might send parents to are very top line with their advice, NHS website and things like that, of course, because it has to be, is a challenge. So I always encourage, other dietitians sort of within my field to be supporting parents with resources that other dietitians, psychologists, or multidisciplinary teams have been able to put together. A lot of health professionals are very good at sharing resources if you ask them nicely. I'm sure Jill has probably got some other, Jill's always doing fantastic teaching, for example, so going and upskilling, learning from people who have done this, who've done this in clinic, who've done this for a long time, and that is backed by research. And starting there, I don't know if Jill has anything else to sort of add to that.
Certainly, if you want to learn about ARFID, there is a diploma put out by Winchester University, which we put together, which I think people have found quite useful. And I would agree with you, when you go to the NHS guidelines, certainly for extreme fussy eating, the advice they give is not useful and it's not correct. So you're getting the wrong advice, the wrong message coming across. And I think sometimes health professionals aren't prepared to say that they don't know. And parents will say to me, I went to this person and they said they didn't know anything about it. And I said, well done then. Because at least they waded in with the wrong advice. And they sort of said, go and ask, there's a charity, ARFID Awareness for avoidant eaters, full of resources, as you know, Lucy.
Yeah.
So sometimes you go to the charity, and you look there, rather than going to the privileged mother websites, I'm afraid, where they're swapping stories about how their child will eat something that I've never heard of. And you think, no, that doesn't help. So yes, you're right. You do have to choose your websites and you have to choose your professionals. But quite often it's sort of word of mouth.
But
I love that expression, the privileged mother websites. Thank you, Julian. I'm going to steal that.
I'm trying to be polite.
But it is so true. There are, trying, somebody on a different income or a restricted income to point them towards a website that says that you should be getting them 27 million different sorts of vegetables, which are totally without of their reach, is not actually helping at all. Would you agree with that, Ellie, that we have to tailor our information? And a further question to that, we hear a lot about vitamin D. Us all living within the Northern Hemisphere, having little access to sunlight, and also seeing within clinics, things like rickets and things making a comeback. What would your advice on vitamin D supplementation? And is it possible for anyone from any background to access that supplementation when they need it?
So just to touch on sort of the idea about sort of tailor making the advice, absolutely. And you hear that from sort of parents and patients and healthcare professionals all the time. There is no point recommending a cream if a patient doesn't have time to put it on, and there's no point recommending certain foods if a patient can't afford that, or if they have a certain religious diet, so they're not actually going to eat that. We have to very, very much individualize care, which is sort of gold standard, isn't it? And healthcare professionals shouldn't be afraid ever to ask those sorts of things. I work in an area of London where I'm quite used to asking patients whether or not they can afford to eat and heat. So unfortunately, we have to get used to asking these questions. It's really important. Yes, vitamin D, absolutely. Obviously, that's government guidelines, and GPs should be able to prescribe vitamin D for toddlers if parents can't afford it, or if they're entitled to Healthy Start vitamins, depending on your borough where you live in the UK. That will either be from your GP or your health visitor, but absolutely. And don't forget, of course, that vitamin D is also in fortified foods. So whilst people within the media, that's me being diplomatic, whilst people within the media like to criticize things like breakfast cereals and foods like that, in fact, those cereals, I think, are fortified and therefore do serve some purpose. Yeah, absolutely, anybody should be able to access vitamin D.
And Lucy, are there any other supplements or any other, main things in that that you would see that people would be the buzzwords that people would be most worried about, which either aren't really that big of a problem or they don't get the focus on which they should?
There's probably both. So there will be, I'm sure that is relatable to a lot of people who are listening, there will be a group of parents who will be very worried about whether their child is getting enough and perhaps want to over supplement or want to look down. I get asked a lot these days about things like probiotics. I get asked about very specific things that I've never heard of, to be completely honest. I'm sure everybody's sat in the same boat. So again, I think it's being able to sit down and have a conversation with parents about things that would be, necessary, e.g. vitamin D as required, but anything else specifically for their diet. And of course, as Ellie alluded to, there might be, within the pathologies that we see in toddlers, reasons why a health professional might recommend additional supplementation. So if you've got a toddler with multiple allergies, for example, or if you've got if you have got a toddler with extreme food refusal who isn't getting everything they need from their diet and perhaps doesn't have all those fortified foods, then good, targeted, appropriate supplementation is something that we should be advising our parents on. But, a lot of the time, the reality is with a few dietary tweaks and a little bit of advice and reassurance, lots of toddlers can get a lot of what they need from their diet anyway. So, we will talk about key nutrients like iron. We know iron is important. We know iron deficiency is very common. And parents can be very worried about this because, for example, their children, they're going through their stage of refusing a lot of foods, and meat is definitely not on the agenda. In fact, that's one of the first things often that's gone, unless it's a chicken nugget or a fish finger or something. So it's empowering them with where else in their children's diet does that actually come from. And again, touching back on what Ellie said, foods that are so often demonized as being dreadful for children, like fortified cereals or bread, can be a fantastic source of a lot of nutrients that toddlers need. And it's about working through what a child is eating with a family and being able to give them those reassurances and target the supplementation where it's necessary and avoid unnecessary spending. I see parents spending tons on so many unnecessary supplements without really good justification about what they do. It's just that, an influencer, a mum bought them, and so she thought that was the best thing to do, for her, their kids.
And Jill, do you see kind of the over pathologizing of particular kids and that whole thing of like, we need to be doing X, Y, and Z or else we're getting it all wrong, and kind of seeing problems where there mightn't be as much of a problem? Or is it more underthought of, they're grand and there's actually a problem?
Can I just add something to what Lucy was saying, was that the problem with the avoidant children is that you won't get the supplements in either, which is when it's important for everybody to be able to say, as you told me, Lucy, the other day, that a particular waffle's got vitamin C, and I was going, because I had a mum who was in tears because her child would only eat potato waffles. And that didn't go down well with the privileged mother's website. So I sort of think, I'm a great fan of the back off, choose your battles. Does it really matter? This is a social construct. If you have a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old who's not sitting at the table, does it really matter? I would sort of say by the time they go to university, they will have learnt to use cutlery and sit at the table. There are so many, aren't they? Sort of, somebody was told by somebody down the pub that they should be doing something. You think, Don't listen to people down the pub. Don't listen to the influencers, just if you get it right 75% of the time, you're doing well, especially with a toddler. And so parents will be terrified that their child's not eating, their child's not sitting, their child's not using their cutlery. And you just think, just chill, really back off. And I think that's what health professionals can do, work with Lucy for ages. And it's that very, you don't need to worry about this, they're fine. But there is one point I'd like to bring in, and that quite often happens, and that is children with ARFID, with really restricted intake, can actually have a very good weight. Yeah, they're growing well. And the parents will say that they went to a health professional, even though the child is only eating, say, 5 foods, and they might be 5 different packets of crisps. And they're told by the health professional that there isn't a problem because they're growing fine. And you think that's where you get the massive nutritional deficiencies, don't you, Lucy? Yeah. And of course, you can't get the supplements in, you can't get the the vitamin drops in because the child won't take it. They won't take the medicines, they won't take the food. So sometimes it really is a problem. And sometimes there isn't a problem that isn't going to resolve itself within a few years. So it's just sort of working out and diagnosing, I think, and assessing properly to reassure parents or say, okay, now we do have a problem. But that
I really liked your point, though, Jill, as us of healthcare professionals, of saying when we don't know something, that it is incumbent on us. We are the trusted expert, and if we're not an expert in that area, then say as much. And to, then we're not giving out poor information. A really good question, and I'll throw this out to you first, Ellie. What's your experience of nutritional deficiencies in restricted eating? So therefore, people that have either a vegan or plant-based or a particular diet, and have you found any particular spray or I haven't seen any of these, but unflavored sprinkles that are helpful or accepted?
Oh, that's interesting. So that's talking about restricted diets as in dietary choices as opposed to pathological restrictive eating, I think. So I think the first thing to say, and this is important sort of for GPs or whoever is the first port of call, we mustn't make the assumption that families who are plant-based are automatically going to be deficient. Often they're not, because there's a lot of thought got into the foods. There are lots of foods. I'm not going to pretend to know too much about food groups, and I've got my dietitian on the panel with me, but there are very good plant-based sources of iron. And similarly, when families become vegan, B12 is the issue, but it actually takes a long time to run out of your B12 because we have a very long-lasting natural stores of it. So generally speaking, and here we go, here's a healthcare professional saying, I don't know about the supplements to advise, and that's because GPs prescribe generically. So we certainly wouldn't be allowed on an NHS budget to prescribe sprays, which obviously would be very helpful for young ones and for children with textural issues or swallowing tablets. But we don't prescribe sprays, and we actually prescribe generically. So I think I would throw that question to Lucy, who might be able to answer that in terms of what there is out there.
Lucy, fire ahead.
I will. The joyous topic of supplementation. So I agree with Ellie. I think often we can very quickly as health professionals jump to the conclusion that everything is going to be going Pete's tongue because things are coming out of their diet. As dietitians, it's often our role to really sit back objectively and look at that. And in terms of, I know sort of part of that question that you put to Ellie was also about how often do you see these nutritional deficiencies. I think one thing I would reflect for any clinicians who are working with children with, restricted eating, fussy eating, extreme fussy eating, ARFID, is that often there are lots of children, remarkably so, when you do actually take a look at what's going on nutritionally, and they're much more sound than you think they are. So again, that can be quite a reassurance for parents. Now, that's not to say there won't be any consequences of only having crisps for 20-something years. There will be. And we know that some blood tests, for example, won't necessarily pick up everything straight away. But if I think of one bit of advice I would give to fellow professionals is you've often got time. Unless there is evidence of a good nutritional deficiency and it's in front of you, it's, this child is lethargic, they're breathless, their iron is in its boots, and you need to be managing something like that, and it's impacting on a variety of things like their appetite and their sleep, etc. You've often got time, and there is a plethora of supplements out there now. So, yes, there are sprays. Yes, there are drops. I know the sprinkles that health professional is referring to, which can be successful with some children who are very unaccepting of a lot of other supplements. They get mixed into preferred foods, although they don't work well when you've got nothing wet or remotely no good vessel for it. Doesn't sprinkle particularly well on toast or biscuits, does it, Jill? So, but I would, what my advice to health professionals would always be, and certainly I've become more confident in this over the years, is to kind of look outside of the box. Are there supplements that would be suitable for older children or adults that, actually a child would take, but you would just have to, carefully and pragmatically adjust the dose, give half of that rather than a full dose of that, or give it every other day. And, really think laterally about that, and then think about ways that you can incorporate it into a routine with a child if they are, if you are able to do that. But the other thing I would say is always making parents aware, if they are thinking about supplementation, or if you're giving advice about supplementation, don't use generic terms if you want something specific, like just go and get some multivitamin, because we've all been to that aisle in the supermarket, haven't we? And you're like, they all say that could just be two vitamins. It could be vitamin A and D, which is no good if you're going away wanting them to get something that's got some iron in it or some zinc in it, for example. So I would say, give parents options, be specific about what they are, but also consider their means, because these things are an expense and they are expensive. So that might also be something that you need to take into account. So do you need it? Which is going to be best? What are you looking for in that supplement? And be, specific and as helpful as possible with parents.
And just to remind everyone to keep the questions coming. And I have a question here specifically for Dr. Harris, for Jill. Is it damaging to suggest tube feeding for ARFID patients? And how long do you let them get? I presume that you would, how low, do you let them get? I presume you're talking about weight. And would tube feeding in toddlers be something that is that kind of last chance corral, or is it something that is done more commonly with very sick kids?
For me, it's last chance corral, and if I can stop that happening, I will. We would normally go for, crossing 2 centile lines and going down, and then we would look and see whether there's something that we can change in the environment. Certainly, when I'm seeing these families in clinic, is it that they have been told to withhold accepted foods, which is a common practice, I'm afraid, health professionals often suggest that, rather than allowing the child the full diet of potato waffles, crisps and ready bread, which covers more or less all bases, I think. They've been told that they've got to withhold it, or they've got to starve the child. So you think, is that happening? Can I reverse it? Can I reverse it quickly, or can we reverse it quickly? Yeah. But sometimes you will have a child who's got so anxious, where things have got so bad that their weight is going down and down and down until they are very lethargic. And you think at that point you would go for tube feeding, bring them back up to a good weight, and then have a plan to wean them off the tube feed. Yeah. But it's very difficult to get a child off a tube feed when they haven't had any food and they don't want any food, if they're very food avoidant. So it's something
then you have an oral, I presume then you have an actual issue then that may have existed to a lesser extent with the sensory, but literally then they don't know how to actually have something in their mouth again.
Yeah. And they can't move it around their mouth, and they've got the disgust response. So you think it is the last chance. And I know from websites that parents are going on the websites which are largely supportive for very avoidant eaters, but sometimes they are terrified that their child will have to go onto a peg feed. They don't have to go onto a peg feed. If you can keep their weight up somewhere, bumping along, if you can get some sprinkles in something, If there's an odd bit of ice cream, you can get the sprinkles in, fine, yeah. And one parent said to me that they were treading water, and I did point out that they weren't drowning. So let's tread water for a while, and it will improve, and it normally does, slowly but gradually. So it's not something you would go for unless you really had to do it, because of, I mean, you know, Ellie and Lucy know that having a peg in is not something simple, and when you get it in, you realise how complicated it can be to manage. So it's not an easy solution.
And Ellie, kind of going back a step with you, kind of on the front line, dealing with parents. Parents can be incredibly anxious about different things. What have you seen most recently being the real anxiety amongst that kind of cohort of parents? Or does it differ in kind of timing or yearly timing? You know, what's your experience of that with regards to parents, and how could we advise people watching of how to help our cohort and our patients?
So I think one thing that's really important, and I hope this is probably reflected by Jill and Lucy as well, is the sort of constant narrative and dialogue in the UK about obesity. And the problem with that in terms of toddlers is parents then sort of unwittingly extrapolate what they hear about obesity and diets and low fat and high protein and diddly-dee. And that's being extrapolated wrongly to toddlers. So as we have alluded, as we've mentioned, you know, potato waffles are fine and cereals are fine and all of these things. Toddlers should not be eating like their parents. They need to have fat and carbs and protein. And that's, you know, so you see a lot of parents who are worried even before being a toddler, even when the babies are just having their formula milk or their breast milk, or when they're being weaned, about sort of the weight being too much, and sort of the obesity from an adult perspective filtering into what people are doing with their toddlers, restricting snacks or sort of this sort of thing, which I think is a shame, but understandable given the obesity narrative. And that sort of comes and goes. I certainly think that there's much more of a worry now, really understandably, again, about allergies, because we talk so much about it, which is fine and that's good. And things like eczema being related to what a toddler is eating, which in most cases it isn't actually, or food allergies or food intolerances. So I'd say they're sort of perennial anxieties, but possibly the obesity one is probably getting more prominent in the last few years.
And Lucy, would you echo that you can see, that we as parents accidentally putting upon our kids a kind of that restrictive idea, or little things that are said or done, or, you know, slimming things being around, and thinking that that's actually something that you need to do for toddlers, which it just isn't.
Yeah, and I think it's actually quite alarming sometimes. You know, I sit and I read these things and I digest these things, or I ask parents to show me, you know, where did you read that? What did you read? And it's as I say, it's quite alarming how much of the diet culture that we've been living with for such a long time filters down into sort of parenting. So like Ellie said, like restricting foods, the covert and overt restriction of foods potentially at home, but also, you know, the language. What I don't think a lot of parents realize is how quickly their little one is grasping what they're saying in terms of their narrative around food or bodies. So how parents talk about their own bodies, how they talk about food, labeling food as good or bad, having food as a reward. So, you know, ice cream is the treat, it's the thing that's earned, so all of a sudden it's up here, versus, you know, the children who can never have the ice cream, they can't have a taste of ice cream until they're at least 2. Those foods are restricted, they see their peers having it and they don't. And it's an interesting sort of paradigm between, with all of that sort of filtering into parenting. And I'm sure, as a parent yourself, it must feel quite hard to sort of navigate that, because it's everywhere, isn't it? And I think the key message for sort of health professionals is really empowering parents with why their toddler's nutrition is different, and how they can pick up on, how be aware that your child picks up on these things. Let's teach children food neutrality. Food is just food. We can talk in a descriptive way about food rather than labeling it as good or bad or healthy or unhealthy. 2-year-olds don't need to know that stuff. It's not relevant. It doesn't get interpreted correctly. I think it's tricky ground because it's everywhere, but it's something certainly to be aware of.
And Dr. Jill, do you see that in your practice as well, that kind of having to re-educate the entire family with regards, not that it's a cause of, but a contributory factor can be the language around food in a home, that the triggering elements of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's not only in the home. I was going to chime in and say that nursery schools are also doing this, aren't they, Lucy? So, my mum was saying that packed lunch going to nursery school. I mean, certainly the children, when they get a diagnosis, can take what they like. But she was saying that they weren't allowed dried fruit or yogurts in their packed lunch, or biscuits or crisps or chocolate. And I'm thinking, what have they got left in there? Was it just the carrot sticks? And you think, I mean, Lucy, you said the research is if you withhold something, if you restrict something, it becomes more desirable. With my children, I forced them to have a bag of sweets every evening, and the bag of sweets would be left around the house. They didn't always eat them. So after their dinner, they had their sweets, and that was it, and they weren't bothered. So, but if I'd withheld it and said, you can only have this when you've had that, and so many parents will do that. And nursery schools do it as well. You've got to eat your sandwich before you can have your yogurt if you're allowed one. And it doesn't matter which order you eat it in. You eat it in where you want to eat it in, and that's fine. And that gives you a healthier balance. And I think all the rules and regulations, and I think Ellie and Lucy were talking about these when we were talking before, there are so many guidelines, so many rules, and you just sort of think, let many of those rules go. And you think toddlers need the full range. I mean, Ellie, as you said, they need the fat, they need some sugar in there. And that's what they have a preference for. And it shouldn't be withheld. And parents will try to do this, and they will have been told to do it by other health professionals. Withhold that, don't give that, don't give them the crisps. And you think the crisps are the things that are keeping them alive. So you get this message all the time, more and more. And I work both in sort of children's eating disorders and eating disorders in general. And you think the messages are coming across more and more and more and more about what you eat, the healthiness of what you eat, the calories in what you eat, which is a new one. And again, it's going down to small children. I have children who are told at nursery school that something in their packed lunch isn't healthy, and that's it. They won't touch it again. And you think, this is 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds. So
it's important as well, sorry to butt in, but it's important as well, isn't it, to explain to parents and to other healthcare professionals that the word healthy actually doesn't mean anything at all. No. So, and all of the labeling on foods doesn't actually mean anything, whether it's natural, whether, any of these things. So if child has ARFID and is about to have a tube, then one could say that it would be very healthy for them to eat a few bags of crisps to prevent that. Or if somebody is on the bread line and can't sort of afford to eat anything, but they have sugary cereal every morning, which is fortified, that is healthy. So the word healthy is an absolute nonsense.
And that it's kind of a misnomer.
I was going to say, Lucy, do you not think that a lot of the foods that parents think are healthy because it's got organic on it or something like that, somebody's kitchen, I'm not saying that anymore, this is marvellous, and you think, have you looked at the ingredients in those? And so not that I care what the ingredients are, but they think that they are healthier, and I would sort of say, let's go for a basic supermarket own version of that, and it will do.
Yeah, we all exist in this. I always remind parents, we exist in this a space where we are being sold to all the time, and companies will use that notoriously to tell you that their product is the best, and they will use all of these buzzwords that are fed to you on social media, in the media, that get talked about at school gates, organic, healthy, da-di-da, all, and you're right. What do they mean, and how do we interpret this? How does that even, what does that even mean? Actually, most people don't know, but they just want to feel like they're doing the best thing. Yeah. And I think that's that re-education around all of these other foods are okay, and they don't have to have all of these labels. And an organic carrot is not got any superior nutritional value than a normal. Is there even a basics carrot? Like, it's just a carrot, isn't it?
Yeah, you can buy a wonky carrot.
A wonky carrot.
You can buy a wonky carrot.
A wonky carrot. Well, that probably is organic because it's therefore wonky. It's not perfect. So I think it is a minefield. And whilst we can, as health professionals, we always sit with having to be respectful of things that are important to families and hearing their story and what matters to them. That is important. We don't want to lose our therapeutic relationships by poo-pooing everything that they're saying all the time. I think it's that gentle sort of re-education about really what is important. And like Jill says, a lot of the time there's a lot of concern about, I want to say to parents, you're always juggling and spinning so many plates. Don't let this be one of them, about whether your carrots are organic or not, or whether this has got prebiotic fiber in it or not. If your child's having fruit and veg and some cereals, they're in a really great probiotic in their diet. There are other things to spin, and again, that's probably a product of how much nutrition noise there is to navigate.
Or another way is allow them to lick a few walls or eat a few keys, and then
definitely do that.
Lots of not to overstart. It's one thing my midwifery had, and certainly as a toddler, I took a really good decision to try and build up that lovely microbiome to allow Felix to eat
everything.
In the park, to just everything goes into the gob for a reason.
Yeah, for a reason. Absolutely.
And I think we sometimes overcomplicate that, even as healthcare professionals. We can forget the most basic things of what are the different phases of learning, and why is that? Why is it an oral phase? Why are they trying to put something into their mouth and telling them constantly no, 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 and then wondering, would you think, Jill, then why we have lots of problems?
Yeah, I mean, certainly. I was going to say that I wanted to back up Ellie in saying that healthy is the thing that keeps you alive. Let's go with that as the bottom line. If you're alive, it's healthy, and then we'll add on from there. Lucy can tell us what to add on from there. But certainly I think when we look at the underlying component of fussy or avoidant eating, it's simply have sensitivity. And the earlier you desensitize, the better. So I used to say when I was working with babies, go roll them in yogurt and mud in the garden, please. And one mum did actually do that and came back 3 weeks later with a desensitized child. So I was like, oh, right, okay, it does work. So we get a lot more of people wiping all the time, cleaning all the time, not taking your child out and rolling it in the mud, not letting them put things in. And especially during the pandemic, you've got sprays and sprays and wipes, and the children are wiped and sprayed and cleaned. No. They need to be dirty. They need to get the dirt in. They need to roll in it. They need to rub it through their hair. Yeah, that's how you desensitize. So I think that, yes, there's been a big problem, I think, with people worrying, as you say, about what goes in the mouth. And you think the more that goes in the mouth, the better at that age.
Yeah, would you echo that as well, Ellie, that you can see that? I mean, during the pandemic, I mean, even for toddlers, like my son was born in July 2018. So when the pandemic hit, he was just hitting his toddlerhood. And so really didn't see anybody except us or people in masks, for a long, long time. And I mean, thank goodness we live beside a lovely park. So we used to go and literally roll him in the mud on a daily basis. But I certainly was worried about his lack of access to normal viral input, and also to the fact of not seeing other people eat normally, so that he would only see us. And I think kids kind of need to eat together almost, that there's there's an element, certainly from nursery, in the nursery that he's in, his diet improved exponentially when he saw other kids eating. He was like, okay, I'm going to try that.
Well, that goes back to what Jill was saying earlier, isn't it? I mean, they're all going to end up sort of leaving home at 18 and they can use a knife and fork. No, I don't want them to leave. And being able to use a knife and fork and being able to eat properly, absolutely the power of peer pressure, whether that is to be toilet trained or to eat properly or any of these things, or to sort of get moving and run around. It's so important at nursery, and children through the pandemic missed out on that. And I think the thing with the cleaning issue and the bugs and the germs and the viruses is, genuinely, I don't think any of us really knew what we were doing. We obviously didn't right at the beginning. Of course we didn't. And everybody was trying to do the best that we can, whether it's the government giving advice or the World Health Organization, or whether it was us as individual people trying to do the best. And we were cleaning this and not cleaning that, and cleaning the post and cleaning the hands of toddlers. And, we were probably told people not to wear masks, and then we told them you must wear masks. So it's not even as if this advice was really sort of proven to be sort of particularly valuable. Of course, a child should wash the mud off their hands, the visible mud off their hands, before they eat their food with their fingers. But they don't need to be carrying an alcohol gel. They don't need to be sort of, bathed. I genuinely had a mum in recently who told me that she bathes her children once a week in Dettol. And that is a pre-pandemic thing. Wow. And it's something that she was always taught was good. And I said, you don't need to do that. And the skin needs to have bacteria on it. It's important. And it was just something that she'd always done, that she felt was essential to keep them sort of clean and decolonized.
I'm lucky if I can get my little fella to bath once a week. It's like,
yeah, absolutely,
like full stop. If I can honestly, I consider, like, if we go for a little dip in the sea, grand, it's water, he'll wash. But do you find, Lucy, in your practice, when we're talking about for healthcare professionals, it can be difficult to know when to escalate up? What is the difference between a fussy eater and then when you would refer somebody up to Jill, or how does that work?
Yeah, and I would hope that there is increasing sort of knowledge increasing and confidence increasing in health professionals with this. And with some good questioning of parents that looks at things like the range of foods they have, the number of foods they have, the textures involved in the food they have. You might have red flags if all a child has ever had is purees, or there's any evidence, as health professionals, we are in a good position to ask some probing questions. Is there evidence of a skill deficit? Has the child missed out on, the key windows of opportunity through weaning because they were recurrently unwell or in and out of hospital? What's happened to this child? What's happened to them? Are there any of those red flags around what they're eating now? Are there any red flags in their history around feeding, around their development, around their skills? Are any of those emerging signs of, sensory sensitivities coming through? And again, just a few probing questions, you can very quickly pull together, an idea about, what's going on with the child. And I would say, some of that really does come down to instinct as well. And the more work that professionals do in this area, the more kind of instinctive it probably gets. I'm sure Jill will agree with that. And I think it comes back to that thing that we've reiterated so many times, is if you're not sure, then ask. And do you know how many times when I was much younger, when I was starting out in pediatrics, and that I said to parents, I'm going to run this by my colleague and then I'm going to call you back. And that, parents totally respect that. And you have that time for a little bit of a sense check, some supervision, somebody who's got experience. I used to phone health professionals in other places of the country if I had really tricky kids. I'm not saying that's, we'll just pick up the phone, it's really easy. But, we're all very happy to share and support, wherever we can. So ask for help if you're not sure. Ask a few more probing questions, not just a diet history as it is at the moment. Ask a little bit more. And usually you've got a good guide then up to whether you can go with some very developmentally appropriate, fussy eating management or whether you need to think about escalating it. And, you know, age even comes into that. Are you sitting in front of a 2-year-old or are you sitting in front of a 10-year-old?
Very true. We've covered so much ground. We're nearly coming to the end of it. My goodness, that has flown. Thank you so much to the audience for your questions. We'll endeavour to get back to you via email if we didn't get your question in the discussion. And thank you so much, Lucy, Jill and Ellie, to our brilliant panel. Before we go, though, coming to you first, Jill, what one final piece of advice would you give to healthcare professionals to, I suppose, get things right with fussy eaters before things can go very wrong?
I think it's something that Lucy said, and that listen to the parents, take a good, careful history. Yeah. I mean, as Lucy said, I had a 7-year-old who was only eating yogurt, and all the health professionals had missed it because they hadn't asked exactly what they were eating. So listen, you know, I have learned by listening to parents.
And Ellie, to you as well, what would be your top tip to fellow healthcare professionals?
Somebody used the word demonize, and I would say let's not demonize parents. There's too much pejorative language anyway out there, as we said, whether things are healthy or unhealthy. We start sort of the demonization of mums, particularly whether they're breastfeeding or bottle feeding. So please, let's not do that as healthcare professionals. We don't know until we've asked. We don't know people's situations or their means or the support they've got. So ask very open questions, no judgment, and make sure that you don't put your views or your own sort of personal opinions, socioeconomic opinions onto your patients. And
Lucy, to you, what's your top tip?
Both of them have stolen them, and now I'm coming up with something else. No, I think I would reiterate that, you know, it can, as a health professional, it can feel like you have a huge weight of responsibility when you sit and you listen and you get in the trench with the family wherever they are and whatever's going on. And I would say, you know, do feel empowered with the information you feel confident about. And if there are things that you sit and you niggle and you go, I'm not sure, it comes back. I'm reiterating something we've said so many times, is go and ask and find out other ways to be able to support your families and understand what's going on a bit better. You know, I remember when I started in pediatrics, I was like, oh, I think I need to learn about child development because I don't know what children are supposed to do at any age, you know. So reflecting on your own learning and like Jill has said, reflecting on the experience of parents is probably the biggest learning curve throughout your career.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for those brilliant insights. We'll draw the discussion to a close. Your certificates to everybody that has been watching will be emailed to you, and recording will be available of this from the Nutrition Academy website in the coming weeks when we've all, you know, been tweaked and made look even more amazing than we look already. And thank you very much to Nutrition for hosting us and providing a space for what I think is a really important discussion to happen. I'm going to go down and guilt-free give Felix a rake of chicken nuggets now. I jest. But thank you so much. And I think more than anything, what's come across is that by having these discussions amongst such brilliant professionals as yourself, we have so much to learn. And by us learning, we can only but help our clients and patients. So thank you so, so much. And we'll say good evening from me, Avril Flynn, and from our wonderful panel, Lucy, Jill and Ellie.
Thank you.